Hi there. Welcome to part two of our series on Power Automate approvals, where we're going to take a look at the actions that are available in the approvals connector. So in the last video, we talked about sort of what an approval is, why you'd want to use it. So if you haven't watched that one yet, that will give you some kind of useful context for what we're going to get into now. So basically, if you've decided that approvals are something you want to use, the next decision to make is how do you create those approvals? Well, there are really two actions in Power Automate that create an approval. So basically, there is a one called start and wait for an approval, and this is kind of the original, the OG approval action, because it's when approvals first rolled out, it was the only action we had. And we'll get into the details of what that action does in just a minute. But there's, aside from the start and wait for an approval, there's also one called create an approval, which does something similar to start and wait for an approval. It's kind of the first part. It's starting the approval, but then there's also a wait for an approval action. So the important thing is that if you're going to use the create an approval action, that needs to be paired in some way with a wait for an approval action, so that it's kind of splitting the starting and waiting into two separate things, which allows you to do some stuff in between if necessary. And we'll talk about why that's needed in just a minute. So first off, talking about the start and wait for an approval. Basically what this does is it generates an approval, and unless you've turned off the notification option, by default notification is yes, it sends an email with an actionable message to the assignee. So the person that you assign the approval to gets an email. It's an actionable message. We saw what that looked like in the first video. But basically in that message, they can click approve, they can click reject, or another custom option if you set it up that way, and submit, and that completes the action. Now the really important thing to know about this start and wait for an approval action is that it's going to create that approval and sit there and wait, meaning nothing else can happen. Well, nothing else in your flow in the same branch is going to happen until the approval completes. So if you want to do something like send a reminder to that person, you can have a separate branch that's going to wait, a parallel branch in the flow that will wait and check for whether that approval is done, but because it's in a separate branch, it can't check for that approval to be done. So it's a little weird. You can't really, creating something as simple as a reminder mechanism for an approval is very, very complicated using the start and wait for an approval action. I've actually never got it to work reliably, which is why I switched to using the other action to create an approval. And this is going to produce basically a full set of outputs. So the outputs being the details of the approval that was created plus the response details. So who responded, what their response was, the comments, and all of that good stuff. So let's take a look at this in action. I'm going to jump over to my browser here, and I'm on the My Flows page. I'm just going to create a new flow. And for simplicity, I'm going to make it an instant flow, so just a button flow, manually trigger a flow, and we'll just call this start and wait for approval, and click create. Now, we could just hard code things like the approver, but just as a kind of a bonus here, I'm going to show you how to add an input for, and this will work for any manually started flow or any instant type flow. So this manually, the button flow, as well as things like for a selected file in OneDrive, for a selected file in SharePoint, for a selected item in SharePoint. Any of those instant flows will allow you to add an input for the approver. Now, the approver needs to be the email address of somebody in your tenant, and that you might say, well, I'll use text and ask people to put in the person's email address, but that's not necessarily a great idea because you can't validate that. You can't require that what they're entering is an email. However, this one that says email is actually email address. It's a little confusing because like I wish this were the at symbol, because I think would be a little more intuitive that this is asking for an email address. But we'll select email, and I'm just going to call this input approvers, and we'll just say approver singular for right now to keep it simple. And then I'm going to add another input, a text input for details. So, and then I'll just add the helper text here. So, who will approve this? And what needs approving? And that's it. So now we're going to add a step, and we'll search for the approvals connector. So there's approvals, and we'll see there are those three, but I'm going to select start and wait for an approval. And there is a kind of a way to see more info on this action very quickly. Click there and it will take you to a page, but we're just going to add it. And first thing we need to do is select what kind of approval. And I'm going to keep it simple with approve, reject, first to respond, because we're only assigning it to a single person. We're perfectly safe to just say first to respond. We could also do an everyone, but we're going to get into these different choices and how they are going to impact. We're just keeping it simple for now. So first to respond, approve, reject. Now we need to give it a title. So I'm just going to call this simple approval, start and wait. And we're going to assign it to, and we're going to get that approver input from our trigger. So that's all we need. And then details, we're going to put in the details, that input that we designated. Now, you can also, if you're setting up an approval for an item, whether that item is an item in a SharePoint list or a file, you can add links here. If you show the advanced options, then you can do things like toggle notifications off if you want, enable or disable reassignment, and even add attachments. We're not going to get into that. You can also specify a requester. Now, by default, it's going to be whoever's action is being used to create this approval. That's going to show as the requester. If you want to show that the approval is coming from somebody else, you can plug in their email address here, and that can be done either hard-coded or dynamically. Again, we're not getting into that here today, but we'll just leave the requester blank. Know that you can change that if you want. Now, I'm just going to add a new step here just to kind of show you what the output of this is going to look like. We're going to compose. Compose is just a good general purpose thing, and then we're going to plug into that the body. And the body is basically the whole response. So the entirety of the output from that action. So I'm going to hit save, and then we'll go back and we'll run this flow just to see what happens with a simple start and wait for an approval. So I will run this, and it's going to say, do you want to sign in, allow this? So sure, yes. And I'm going to just, for simplicity, make myself the approver and say I want a donut. It will run that flow, and it's done, and we'll see that flow is running. And if we go in and look at the run history for that flow, we'll see there we've triggered it, we've given it the approver, we've given it the details, and then it starts and wait. And all we can see is that this generated the approval. We can't see anything else. So we can't see the compose because it hasn't, basically this is in a holding pattern. It's going to wait for this approval to be completed. And again, that means you can't send reminders. Also remember that there is sort of that overarching time limit of 30 days for flow to complete. So if you even suspect that it's going to take more than 30 days for somebody to approve something, this is not the action to use. Again, because it's essentially after 30 days, it just times out and the flow stops. So even if that person comes and in day 35 sees the email and approves the thing, the flow that it's connected to is no longer running. So there's no way to, you know, whatever subsequent actions happen in that flow are not going to happen. So that's the main limitation, is that is this just going to sit here and wait for that approval to finish. So let's finish that approval. I'll just go over to my email, go into Outlook, and there is our simple approval, start and wait. I don't know why this is taking so, it's being so slow, but we can see that it's a simple approval. I'm being asked to approve a donut. I'm going to reject that. So I'll click reject and say no donut for you and submit. So again, I'm able to complete that right here in the email. It updates automatically to show me what my response was and my comments. And now if we go back over to this flow history, well, there we go. So it's completed. So now that the person has acted on that approval, it's done and it can proceed with the rest of the flow. And then if we go to the compose, we can see this is all of the response data that's coming out of it. So we've got the display name, the email, the principal name, when it was sent, when it was responded to, what the response was, what their comments were, etc. So this is all going to be important, and we'll come back to that later. But for right now, we just know that with start and wait for an approval, it starts the approval and just sits and waits for them to finish, for them to respond, I should say. And if the flow times out in between, then oh well, it's not going to respond, or it's not going to finish because it will have timed out. All right, so let's take a look at our other option. So if we jump back over to our PowerPoint here, so that's start and wait for an approval. Create an approval kind of is, as I said, it's the first part of that start and wait. So it's creating the approval object and sending the notification, again, unless notifications disabled. What that means is that it's just sending the email, creating that approval, but then allowing subsequent actions to fire as you would expect them to run. It does need to be followed up, as I mentioned before, not immediately, but at some point down the chain, you need a wait for an approval action in order to intercept that response. So in other words, the approval gets created, and then you need to add another action at whatever point you want to evaluate the completion condition for that approval. Add that wait for an approval action, give it the ID, and there you go. Now, the one really cool thing about this create an approval action is that it also produces one of the outputs that it creates is an adaptive card, which you can put into a Teams message. So if you're in an organization where you're heavily leveraging Teams, and you want to have these approvals exclusively completed through Teams, this is basically a better way to do that, because you can post that adaptive card to the user in the team, in a Teams chat message. Whereas then you're not relying, you can basically turn off that email notification, just send it to them through Teams and have them complete it through Teams. So let's just take a quick look at creating an approval that uses that. So I'm going to go back to my flows and we'll create a new flow. And again, we'll use the instant flow. And I'll call this create an approval and then wait. So we'll create that. And again, we're going to add inputs for the approver and the details. And then we'll add a new step, and this time we will select the create an approval action. And the setup of this is very similar. We have the same kind of options, so I'm going to again select approve reject first to respond, and then the title would be create and wait for approval. Actually, I'll just call this create and approval. And again, we'll assign it to the approver. For the details, we will select details. And again, we have the same advanced options where we can set a specific requester, we can enable notifications, yes or no, reassignment, add attachments, and all that fun stuff. Alright, so we're just creating an approval. And again, just so that we can see the output of that, I'm going to throw a compose step in here. And again, I'm going to give this the body of that create an approval action and hit save. And when it finishes saving, we'll go back and we will run this. And again, continue. And again, I'll make myself the approver. And maybe now I want a pizza. And I can run that flow. Done. Now, watch the run history here. If I refresh, we'll say, hey, it succeeded. It succeeded, but the approval isn't complete yet. And that's because, again, all this is doing is generating that approval. So when I go and view the run history, yep, it created the approval. And in the compose action, we can see the outputs of that. So we've got the the approvers, we've got the respond link, the adaptive card, the title, all that good stuff. So basically all it did is create the approval and send it. Now if I go over to my email and I go here and I say, yep, I'm going to approve that pizza, enjoy, and submit that. But because all the flow did was generate the approval and send it out, there's no way to evaluate the response. So there's no way to even let the person know that their approval was approved or rejected. So it is kind of that's why you need that secondary action. So I'm going to edit this, and we're going to add in another step, and this will be wait for an approval. And this is going to take as an input the approval ID, or the ID of the approval. So we need to go to the create an approval action and find approval ID, and that's that. Now I'm going to add another compose here. And for this, we're going to give it the, again, we want the body, but we want the body of the wait for an approval, because that's going to give us the outputs of the action, or the results of the approval. So when I hit save, and we'll go and we'll run this flow again. So let's run it again. This time, same approval, me, and now I'm going to ask for a healthy salad, and click run, and done. Now we'll see that this is running, and it's still running. So if I go in here and I look at the flow run, we can see that it's generated the approval, and we've got the compose action, the outputs of that. So it's created the approval as before, but now it's sitting and waiting. So it's going to wait, and again, we're still bound by that 30-day time limit. So if you do want to send reminders or whatever, this is where you would basically add add a parallel branch where you can send a reminder, and that's a little more complicated. I have another video, an old video on that I'll link in the description below. But basically, this is splitting it up like this is required if you want to be able to send those reminders in the middle and have some kind of default action. So my feeling is if you know the flow is going to time out in 30 days, let people know that that's a limitation, and make sure that you define what should happen if they don't respond. In most cases, it's going to be, well, if it wasn't specifically approved, we're going to default to rejecting it. That's kind of the safe bet, but again, it depends on your scenario. You need to discuss that with whoever's looking for this process, whoever wants this process implemented. But the point is that this splitting it up this way allows you to incorporate the reminders and that default behavior. So now if I go in and I say, you know what, I'm going to approve that. Yes, eat more salad. And submit. And momentarily, yep, so that's finished. We can again see my details. We can see the response, including the approve, the eat more salad, and all that good stuff. So hopefully this has helped to clarify kind of what those differences are. If we jump back to our PowerPoint, so we've got the create an approval, we've got the wait for an approval, that is really just sitting there waiting for that approval to finish. So what we're left with now is kind of which of these should we use, which one to use when. That's the big question with Microsoft 365 in general. Is there's all of these tools, what do we use in what situation? Well, that start and wait for an approval is just a little bit easier to set up because you're just creating that one action that's handling both the creation of it and the evaluation of it. But as we saw, there's the downside of the fact that nothing else in that flow can happen until the approval is acted upon. So you're kind of you're at the mercy of that waiting period. Whereas using the pair of the create an approval and wait for an approval is a little bit more complicated to set up because you have to add both actions and know to add both actions. But because they are separate, you have more flexibility. So you can define other things that happen in between. So for example, if you want to log all of these approvals into some central list to say when the approval was sent, you can create that approval and then log that in an Excel file or SharePoint list or whatever. Or maybe just send an email to maybe some other interested party to let them know that this approval process has begun. So you have the ability to do that without waiting for the approval to finish. So you can kind of do other things in between. And generally speaking, if I know that it's a quick and simple, send the approval and I know the people are going to respond to it quickly, start and wait for an approval is perfectly fine. I kind of only use it for single approver situations because otherwise it can be complicated when to explain to folks, well, this is going to wait for all of the approvers to finish to make their decisions. So you just need to factor that in. Whereas create an approval and waiting separately is better when you have multiple approvals, or really anytime you want to do something in between the creation and the completion. So multiple approval scenarios where you need to do either sequential approval or escalations, or again sending reminders. Maybe you want to say if this isn't approved in 10 days, assign it to this person, and if it's not approved in 10 days, then assign it to that person's manager. Using the split actions is going to allow you to do that. So hopefully this was helpful to you. In the next video, we're actually going to take a look at sort of the, those types of the approval types aspect a little bit more, where we've got this built-in choices of approve and reject. But more than that, we want to think about sort of the wait for everyone or the first to respond, because that's kind of the big question, especially when you are talking about having multiple approvers. You need to think about how you're going to do that. And we're also going to talk a bit about the difference between sort of one approval that's sent to a bunch of people and sending a bunch of people the same approval. There is a difference, and it'll make sense when you see that video, when I get around to filming it. It should be in the next week or so. But hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, throw those in the comments down below, and have a great day.